My mother-in-law dumped something foul all over my wedding dress and left a note, "Know your place." In front of 200 guests, I wore it anyway, took my father's arm, and walked down the aisle without crying once. Then I smiled at the groom and whispered, "Your mother forgot one thing. I know the secret that will destroy you both." I was standing in the bridal suite of the Ashford Manor estate, just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, when I found it. The dress was supposed to be hanging exactly where Tessa had left it 20 minutes earlier, pristine, untouched, waiting for me to step into it for the most important hour of my life. Instead, it hung from the closet door like something had attacked it. A dark stain had bloomed across the silk bodice, spreading down into the hand-stitched lace at the waist, dripping in slow, fat drops onto the hardwood floor. The smell hit me before my mind caught up with what I was looking at. Rancid, sour, garbage left too long in summer heat. For 10 full seconds, I didn't move. I just stared at it the way you stare at a car accident, certain that if you look long enough, the picture will rearrange itself into something that makes sense. It didn't. Tucked into the ruined lace, pinned there deliberately, almost lovingly, was a small cream-colored note card. I recognized the handwriting before I even picked it up. Eleanor Whitmore wrote every cruelty like she was addressing a thank you card to the country club. "Know your place." Behind me, Tessa, my maid of honor since we were 19 years old and broke together in a college dorm in Richmond, made us sound like she'd been hit in the stomach. Maya, who did this? I already knew. For 2 years, I had absorbed Eleanor Whitmore the way you absorb weather. The comments about my background, the way she introduced me to her friends as Daniel's girlfriend. She does something with numbers for the state, like my career was a hobby I'd grow out of. The way she once asked, in front of an entire dinner table, whether my father was comfortable covering the cost of his own suit for the wedding. And every single time, Daniel would lean over, kiss my forehead, and murmur the same 4 words. "She's just protective." Protective. That was his word for cruelty whenever it came wrapped in pearls and a Talbot's cardigan. My father knocked once and stepped into the suite. He was 64 years old, a retired boxing coach from a gym outside Roanoke. A man with hands like cracked leather and a face that had never learned how to hide what he was feeling. He saw the dress. I watched the color drain out of him and then come roaring back red. "Maya." His voice was low, dangerous in a way I'd only heard twice before in my life. "Who touched this dress?" "I'm wearing it," I said. "No, baby. We get you something else. We push the ceremony. I'm wearing it, Dad." Tessa grabbed my arm. "You cannot walk in front of 200 people looking like this. Maya, think about what you're saying." I turned and looked at myself in the full-length mirror bolted to the closet door, right next to the ruined dress. My hair was pinned exactly the way I wanted it. My makeup was soft, expensive, flawless. 3 hours in the chair that morning for precisely this moment. My hands, I noticed, were not shaking. The woman looking back at me did not look shattered. She looked done, waiting. "That's exactly why I can," I told Tessa. Downstairs, I could hear the string quartet starting their first set, the murmur of 200 voices settling into white folding chairs beneath a tent strung with crystal and white roses that had cost more than my father made in 3 months at the gym. Judges were down there. Bankers, 2 state senators, people who had built entire identities around spotless reputations and filthy secrets they kept very well hidden, or so they believed. They thought I was a fortunate girl, marrying several rungs above her station, into the Whitmore name, into Whitmore money, into a family that had been quietly running half of Central Virginia's hospitality development for 3 generations. What none of them knew, what not even Daniel knew, was that I had spent the last 6 months marrying beneath myself with my eyes wide open, watching, documenting, and waiting. I stepped into the ruined dress. The fabric was cold and wet against my skin where the stain had soaked through, and I made myself breathe through it. My father's jaw worked silently, but he held out his arm anyway, because that is who my father is, and has always been. At the chapel doors, he leaned down and whispered, "Tell me what to do, and I'll do it." I squeezed his hand once. "Walk slowly," I said. "My name is Maya Delacroix Reyes. I am 29 years old, and before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand exactly who I am, and exactly what I had spent half a year quietly building, because none of what came next was an accident, and very little of it was improvised. I grew up 40 minutes outside Albemarle County, in a small house that smelled like my mother's lavender hand cream, and after she died of ovarian cancer when I was 14, like nothing at all for a very long time. My father raised me alone on a boxing coach's salary, which is to say, not much, and a great deal of love, which is to say, more than enough. We never had extra. I remember him slitting his own blood pressure medication in half some months just to stretch the prescription until the next paycheck, telling me it was fine. He didn't need the full dose anyway, when I now understand, as an adult who reads financial statements for a living, that he absolutely did. I put myself through James Madison University on scholarships and 2 part-time jobs, graduated with a degree in forensic accounting, and took a position with the Virginia State Attorney's Financial Crimes Division 3 years ago. It is not a glamorous job. It involves spreadsheets, subpoenaed bank records, shell company filings, and an enormous amount of patience. But it is exacting work, and it had taught me, long before I ever met Daniel Whitmore, how to read a paper trail the way other people read a room. I met Daniel at a charity gala I was working, not attending, cross-referencing donor disclosure forms against a separate ongoing case that had nothing to do with him. He found me by the dessert table, charming in the easy, practiced way of someone who had never once in his life needed to try very hard for anything. And for the first several months, I let myself believe that charm was simply who he was, rather than a skill he had been raised to perform. It took almost a year for the cracks to show. Money disappearing from accounts he claimed were just for taxes, calls he stepped outside to take, a business partner of his mother's who flinched visibly whenever the Whitmore Foundation came up at dinner, and Eleanor, always Eleanor, orbiting every conversation, every decision, every dollar with a kind of proprietary control that I slowly realized was not protectiveness at all. It was ownership. 6 months before the wedding, Daniel made a mistake. He copied me, accidentally, on an email chain, meant only for his mother and their family attorney, discussing how to move a series of payments through the Whitmore Foundation's charitable accounts to cover what the email politely called Mother's outstanding obligations in Atlantic City. I did not confront him. I am a forensic accountant. Confrontation is not how you build a case. Documentation is how you build a case. For 6 months, I quietly gathered everything. Bank transfer records I had legitimate access to through routine financial crimes division channels. Once a formal inquiry was opened internally based on what I'd seen. Screenshots of texts between Eleanor and her event planner about about structuring donor pledges. A zoning official in Albemarle County who, it turned out, had received 3 suspicious cash deposits in the same week the Whitmore family's new resort development received an unusual and expedited approval. I worked with 2 colleagues in my division, carefully, methodically, the way you build something that needs to survive a defense attorney tearing at every seam. By the week of the wedding, I had a sealed evidence file, a cooperating witness inside the Whitmore Foundation's accounting office, and a warrant application ready to be filed the moment the investigation went active. I had not planned to use my own wedding as the moment it all came forward. That part, I will be honest with you, was Eleanor's doing, not mine. The garbage water on my dress was not strategy. It was rage. The rage of a woman who had spent 2 years sensing that I was not the harmless, grateful, background-appropriate girl she had decided I should be, and who had finally, perhaps from some genuine instinct that something was closing in on her, decided to humiliate me before I could do whatever it was she feared I might do. She had no idea how right that fear was, or how close. The chapel doors opened, and every conversation in that room stopped at once. 200 faces turned toward me. I watched the reaction move through the crowd in waves. First smiles, automatic, reflexive, the kind you give a bride. Then confusion. Then, as the stain became impossible to misread as some strange design choice, horror. Someone near the front dropped their program. A phone rose to capture the moment, then lowered, uncertain, then rose again. I heard a woman 2 rows back whisper, "Oh my God," to no one in particular. At the altar, every drop of color left Daniel's face. Beside him, Eleanor Whitmore smiled. It was small, careful, the kind of expression a woman who has spent 40 years in rooms like this one has trained herself to control even in triumph. She believed I would dissolve into tears, turn and run from that chapel in shame, and that my humiliation would prove, finally and publicly, exactly the point she had been making about me for 2 years without ever quite saying it out loud. I kept walking. My father's arm trembled slightly beneath my hand. Mine did not. Step after step, beneath white roses that had cost more than his mortgage payment, toward a man who had lied to me across restaurant tables, in our bed, and once, unforgivably, in front of a photograph of my mother that sat on my nightstand. When I reached him, Daniel leaned in, his voice a furious hiss meant only for me. "Maya, what in God's name are you doing?" I smiled at him the way a bride is supposed to smile. "Your mother forgot one thing," I whispered. "I know the secret that will destroy you both." His eyes cut sideways to Eleanor, fast, involuntary. Good. Fear recognizes fear. The efficient and older Episcopal priest who had married 3 generations of Whitmores cleared his throat and opened his small leather book. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." "Wait," I said. A ripple of confusion moved through 200 guests. Daniel's hand closed around my wrist. "Don't embarrass yourself any further than you already have." I looked down at his hand until he let go of it, then I turned to face the room. "I apologize for the delay," I said, and my voice carried, clean and even, through the small wireless microphone Tessa had clipped beneath the floral arch that morning, ostensibly for the vows. "Before we begin, I'd like to thank Eleanor Whitmore for the note she left tucked into my dress this afternoon." A murmur lifted across the tent. Eleanor's careful smile vanished. I raised a small stained note card I had carried down the aisle, folded inside my bouquet. "Know your place," I read aloud. "Maya, stop this right now," Daniel said under his breath. I did not stop. For a long time, I believed my place was beside Daniel. I told the room. I overlooked a great deal to believe that. The secretive phone calls, the money that kept disappearing from accounts I was told not to ask about, the way his mother answered questions that were addressed to him. I turned and looked directly at Daniel. But standing here today, in this dress, I remembered what my actual place is. I reached into my bouquet and drew out a small silver flash drive that had been resting among the white ranunculus since that morning. "My place," I said, "is senior forensic accountant with the Virginia State Attorney's Financial Crimes Division." The silence that followed was complete enough that I heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath 3 feet away. Most of the guests knew I worked in finance, in the vaguest possible sense. Daniel had always introduced me at events as someone who did numbers for the state, delivered with the same gentle condescension he used for anything he considered beneath the family's usual circles. Almost no one in that tent understood exactly what division, or exactly what that meant for the next 10 minutes of their lives. I nodded once toward the back of the tent, where Tessa stood at the small sound and lighting console that had, until that moment, been set up for a slideshow of Daniel and me as children. The screen behind the altar flickered to life. Instead of childhood photographs, the first image was a bank transfer record, then a shell company filing, then a string of signatures and dates that I had spent 6 months assembling into a single undeniable timeline. Daniel stepped toward the console. "Turn that off. Turn it off right now." From the back of the tent, Tessa's voice came clear and steady over a second microphone. "Touch her, and I send the complete file to every phone in this room in the next 60 seconds. I faced the guests again. 200 faces I had spent the better part of a year smiling politely for. Daniel and Eleanor Whitmore have spent the last 3 years moving funds out of the Whitmore Family Foundation, a registered Virginia charitable organization, to cover personal gambling debts, finance an undisclosed renovation project, and, according to records obtained through a sealed investigation, secure an expedited zoning approval for the Ashford Ridge Resort development through a cash payment to a county zoning official. I let that settle for a moment. They also intended, after this wedding, to have me sign financial documents that would have made me personally liable for a portion of that debt. Eleanor rose halfway out of her seat. "She is lying. This is a fabrication. This woman has clearly lost her mind." I clicked the small remote in my hand once. The screen changed to security footage, time-stamped from 3 hours earlier, pulled from the Ashford Manor's own hallway camera system, the kind every modern event venue runs on a networked loop for liability purposes. Eleanor Whitmore, in the same pale blue dress she was wearing at that exact moment, walking into the bridal suite hallway. Eleanor opening the closet door. Eleanor pouring something dark from a covered container over the dress. Eleanor tucking a small cream card into the ruined lace before walking calmly away, smoothing her hair as she went. The tent erupted. "Turn it off!" Eleanor's voice cracked across the chaos, and in that single unguarded moment, I watched 200 guests see for the first time the woman underneath 4 decades of careful pearls and careful smiles. Daniel lunged toward the sound console, but my father stepped directly into his path. 64 years old, a retired boxing coach who still moved like a man who had spent 30 years teaching other people how violence works and exactly how to avoid needing it. "Sit down, son," my father said very quietly. Daniel sat down. 2 men in plain dark suits stepped through a a side entrance of the tent. Men who were not part of the venue's catering or security staff. Eleanor recognized one of them on sight, and I watched her knees genuinely buckle for the first time in the entire ceremony. I had not arrived at my own wedding hoping to create a public spectacle. I had arrived with a sealed evidence file, 2 cooperating witnesses, signed affidavits, and a warrant already filed that morning with a Charlottesville magistrate set to be executed that evening regardless of what happened at the altar. The dress, the note, the garbage water poured over hand-stitched silk 3 hours before my wedding had never been part of my plan. It had only ever been Eleanor's gift to me, wrapping paper around a package that was already coming. One of the investigators stepped up to Daniel. "Daniel Whitmore, we need you to come with us." He looked at me like I was the one who had betrayed him. It nearly made me laugh out loud, standing there in a ruined wedding dress in front of 200 witnesses. "You set me up," he said. "No," I told him. "You committed felony fraud and bribery in emails you copied me on, because you assumed I was too unimportant to understand them." Eleanor's finger shook as she pointed it at me. "You disgusting little opportunist, you wanted our name. You wanted this family's money." I stepped close enough that only the front 2 rows could hear me clearly. "Eleanor," I said, "your name is about to be printed under the words charity, fraud, and bribery of a public official on the front page of every paper from Richmond to Washington." Her mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. Then, all across the tent, phones began to chime and buzz in a low, rolling wave. Tessa had sent the evidence summary, along with a link to the sealed filing that had already been submitted to the court that morning, to every guest on the wedding list simultaneously. Not rumor, not gossip, bank transfers, recorded calls, voicemails between mother and son discussing exactly how to keep the money moving. Daniel's best man stood and quietly stepped away from him. A judge in the 3rd row rose without a word and walked out of the tent entirely. One of the senator's wives covered her mouth with both hands. The donors clustered near the back began whispering to one another in low, sharp tones that sounded, even from where I stood, like blades being drawn. Daniel tried one final performance. His voice dropped, soft, pleading, the same tone he had used 100 times to talk me out of asking questions I should have asked years earlier. "Maya, please, we can fix this. I love you." I looked down at my ruined dress, at the dark stain that had dried stiff against the silk, then back up at the man who had watched, year after year, while his mother ground me down in small, deniable cruelties, because her cruelty toward me had always, somehow, benefited him. "You don't love me," I said. "You love the signature you thought I'd give you." The investigator took his arm. Eleanor shoved past a row of folding chairs, knocking one over. "You cannot do this to my family." "My family," I said, turning toward my father, who stood exactly where he had stood the entire time, steady, unmoving. The only fixed point in that entire collapsing room is standing right beside me. The chapel doors opened a second time that afternoon. This time Daniel and Eleanor Whitmore were the ones led through them, not me, while 200 guests who had once looked straight through me as decoration watched their family's flawless reputation walk out beneath the same white roses they had paid for. I unpinned the veil and handed it to my father. "Ready to go, baby?" he asked gently. I looked around the tent one final time, at the flowers, at the still rolling phone cameras, at the wrecked expressions of people who would be telling this story at their own dinner tables for years. "No," I said, "I paid for half this reception myself. I'm not skipping the cake." So I changed, in the same bridal suite where it had all begun 3 hours earlier, into a simple ivory dress Tessa had hidden in the trunk of her car months ago, just in case, she later admitted. She'd had a feeling. I walked back into the reception, took my father's hand, and danced the first dance alone with him, while the untouched wedding cake sat behind us under the tent lights. By the time dessert was served, nearly half the guest list had quietly approached me to apologize for things they had said or laughed at over the past 2 years. By midnight, 3 of the Whitmore Foundation's largest donors had given formal statements to the investigators still working the scene. By the following morning, the story had reached every major paper in the state, and by the end of that week, 2 national outlets had picked it up as well. 6 months later, the Whitmore Family Foundation was formally dissolved by court order. Eleanor pled guilty to charitable fraud and obstruction of a financial investigation under Virginia State Code and accepted a plea deal that still carries active probation conditions and a permanent ban from serving on any nonprofit board in the Commonwealth. Daniel's resort development collapsed within weeks once his business partners withdrew. His personal and joint accounts were frozen pending restitution proceedings, and the engagement photo that once sat on the Whitmore family's own website became, for a brief and humiliating stretch, one of the most widely circulated images in the entire region, for reasons that had nothing to do with romance. As for me, I kept my mother's veil. I sold the ruined wedding dress, stain and all, to a collector who specializes in objects with documented legal history, for considerably more money than it had originally cost, and I bought a small house outside Charlottesville with good light in every window, and no one in it who has ever once asked me to know my place. People sometimes ask me now whether I regret walking down that aisle in a ruined dress in front of 200 people. I tell them the truth. That was not the day I was humiliated. That was the day everyone in that room finally saw the stain that had been there all along. If you came here from Facebook because this story pulled you in, please go back to the Facebook post, hit like, and comment exactly justice to support the storyteller. That small action means more than it seems, and it gives the writer real motivation to keep bringing you more stories like this.